Let me tell you about the house. Not the house as it stands now, a quiet suburban box filled with the mundane, beautiful chaos of a family, but the house as it was then, a stage. A meticulously set stage upon which a very particular kind of drama was meant to unfold. We had been searching for months, Sarah and I, adrift in the vast, unforgiving sea of the Portland rental market. We were looking for that mythical creature, a safe, clean, affordable space with enough square footage to contain the explosive energy of our two children, Emma and Liam, and the quiet, sprawling ambitions of our own lives. We were looking for a home, the kind you see in advertisements for insurance companies, a place where you could imagine growing old, a backdrop for a life well lived. When we found the house on Chestnut Street, it felt like a miracle. A three-bedroom craftsman with good bones, a kitchen bathed in the soft, forgiving light of the afternoon sun, and a backyard that was a lush, green promise of future barbecues and swing sets. It seemed too good to be true, and that, as I would come to learn with a soul-crushing, gut-wrenching certainty, was because it was. The architect of this particular miracle was our landlord, a man named Grayson. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with the kind of expansive, predatory confidence that consumes all the oxygen in a room before he even speaks a word. He was not merely a landlord. He was the landlord, a platonic ideal of the role, rendered in flesh and expensive cologne. On the day we signed the lease, he greeted us at the door not as a property owner, but as a benevolent king welcoming us to his fiefdom. His handshake was a vice, his smile a flash of brilliantly white, perfectly capped teeth. But his eyes were the first discordant note in the symphony of perfection. They were the eyes of a wolf, assessing, calculating, a little too pleased with the sheep that had just wandered into his pasture. I ignored it. I was a man desperate for a home, and desperation is a powerful anesthetic. "This is your new kingdom," he declared, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone, as he led us through the freshly painted rooms. "A place fit for a man like you, Michael. And, of course, for your beautiful family." The way the words beautiful family rolled off his tongue, with a slight, almost imperceptible emphasis, made me glance at Sarah. She was smiling, that polite, social smile she had perfected, but I saw her shift her weight, a small, subtle adjustment of her posture that was a sign of her discomfort. I dismissed it. What landlord doesn't flatter his new tenants? The house was, by all objective measures, perfect. The kids were ecstatic, their joyous shouts echoing through the empty rooms as they claimed their territories. Sarah was in love with the light, the way it poured through the large, mullioned windows. And I was in love with the idea of a quiet corner, a small, sunlit room that I could finally call my office. It was a fresh start, a blank page. Grayson's terms were more than reasonable. The rent was fair, the deposit standard. "You take care of my house," he said, his smile showing just a little too much of those perfect teeth, "and I'll take care of you." His gaze, as he said it, lingered on Sarah for a fraction of a second too long. A detail so small, so fleeting, that to comment on it would have been to admit to a paranoia I didn't believe I possessed. The first few weeks were a honeymoon period. We unpacked, we settled in, we began the slow, joyful process of transforming a house into a home. Grayson, true to his word, took care of us. A little too well. He would pop by, as he put it, with a frequency that began to feel less like diligence and more like surveillance. One day, it was to check the gutters. The next, it was to drop off some specialty fertilizer for the lawn. His reasons were always plausible, his visits always unannounced. "He's just eccentric," I told Sarah, trying to convince myself as much as her. Probably lonely. But I could see the unease in her eyes, even as she tried to hide it. When he would appear at our door, a looming, smiling presence, she would find a reason to retreat to the kitchen, to busy herself with some sudden, urgent task. The kids, bless their innocent hearts, were oblivious. To them, Grayson was the funny landlord who brought them candy and called them little champions. But his presence was a low-grade, persistent irritant to me. It was the way he would subtly position himself between Sarah and me in conversation, a quiet, physical assertion of dominance. It was the way his compliments were always aimed at her, and always just a little too personal. "You're a lucky man, Michael," he said to me once, his eyes fixed on Sarah. Not every man gets a wife who looks like that after 2 kids. He chuckled, a sound that was meant to be convivial but landed like a stone in my gut. I did not laugh. I should have trusted that feeling. I should have recognized him for what he was. A predator who moved not with the speed of a cheetah, but with the slow, patient, inexorable creep of a python. Men like him do not strike, they test. They push boundaries, an inch at a time, a millimeter at a time, until you are so thoroughly constricted, so completely enveloped in their world, that you don't even realize you can no longer breathe. But he made one fatal miscalculation. He underestimated me. He mistook my quiet, rational nature for weakness. And he was about to learn, in the most definitive and brutal way possible, what happens when you push a quiet man too far. Intuition, they say, is the whisper of the soul. For a man who built his life on the solid bedrock of logic and reason, I had always been skeptical of such ethereal notions. But the human mind has its own, more primitive, intelligence, a kind of animal instinct that can sense a predator long before the rational brain has processed the threat. My instincts had been screaming about Grayson for weeks. But instinct is not evidence. And I am a man who requires evidence. The discovery, when it came, was not the result of a deliberate investigation. It was a product of the mundane, domestic chaos of a Tuesday evening. Sarah was at the kitchen counter, a whirlwind of chopping and stirring, crafting one of her culinary masterpieces from the contents of our refrigerator. I was in the living room, the designated homework czar, navigating the treacherous waters of 4th grade long division with Emma and 3rd grade grammar with Liam. The house was filled with the comfortable, chaotic symphony of family life. The rhythmic thud of a knife on a cutting board, the scratch of pencils, the occasional, explosive giggle from one of the kids. "Michael," Sarah called out, her voice a pleasant, musical note. "Can you grab my phone from the bedroom? I think I left it on the nightstand." A simple request. A mundane chore. A hinge upon which my entire world was about to pivot. The phone was where she'd said it would be, a sleek, dark rectangle on the polished wood of her nightstand. As I picked it up, the screen illuminated, a silent, glowing messenger from another world. A notification banner appeared at the top of the screen. I wouldn't have given it a second thought, but the preview text was a string of words so jarringly out of context, so utterly alien to the life I thought we were living, that I froze. "Can't stop thinking about last time. When can we talk again? Asterisk." My heart executed a painful, stuttering beat. The message was from an unsaved number. My mind, a frantic, desperate defense attorney, began to present its case. Asterisk, a coworker. A friend from college. A wrong number. Asterisk, but the words were not the words of a friend. Last time. What last time? I am not a man who snoops. I believe in privacy, in the sacred, unspoken trust that is the foundation of a marriage. But trust is not a blind, unconditional faith. It is a living thing, and it requires proof of life. In that moment, staring at that screen, I felt the vital signs of our trust flatlining. I unlocked her phone. The passcode was the kids' birthdays, a detail so grotesquely sentimental it felt like a fresh, new betrayal. The message thread was a revelation. It was a chronicle of a secret, parallel life. The texts, which went back weeks, were not explicitly sexual, but they were intimate in a way that was almost worse. They were filled with inside jokes, shared confidences, a level of easy, conspiratorial familiarity that sent a chill through my bones. "You looked stunning today. Wish I could have stayed longer. Asterisk. Don't forget our little secret. Winky face asterisk. Let me know when he's out of the house. Asterisk." That last one. That was the one that made the floor fall away. I was he. A nameless, faceless obstacle in their secret world. My hands were shaking. The phone felt like a hot, venomous thing in my palm. The sender was not identified by name, but the context, the casual references to the house, to his surprise visits, the specific, oily cadence of the words, it was him. It was Grayson. My first, primal instinct was to storm into the kitchen, to hurl the phone, the evidence, the accusation, at her feet. To watch her perfect, domestic world shatter around her. But something held me back. Not just the thought of the children, though that was a powerful anchor. It was a cold, hard, and deeply unfamiliar pragmatism. If I confronted her now, she would deny. She would deflect. She would gaslight me until I was the one who was crazy, paranoid, insecure. I needed more. I needed something undeniable. I placed the phone back on the nightstand, my movements precise, deliberate. I walked back downstairs, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. Sarah was humming in the kitchen. The kids were bent over their workbooks. The diorama of our happy family life was still perfectly intact, but I could now see the cracks. I could see the rot beneath the surface. That night, I lay in bed, the space between Sarah and me a vast, frozen tundra. Every word she had ever spoken about Grayson, every forced smile, every awkward, lingering glance, was now recontextualized, reinterpreted through the lens of this new, terrible knowledge. The way he had looked at her. The way his compliments had been just a little too personal. The way he always seemed to appear when I wasn't there. It had not been in my head. My instincts had been right. I was not just a husband who had been betrayed. I was a man who was being played. And I decided, in the cold, silent dark of that bedroom, that I would not be a pawn in their sordid little game. I would become a player. I would find out the truth, the whole truth, no matter how much it hurt. And the truth, I suspected, was going to be far, far worse than a few secret text messages. There is a particular kind of cold, clear-headed rage that descends upon a man when he realizes he has been systematically underestimated. It is not the hot, explosive fury of a sudden confrontation, but a slow, quiet, and infinitely more dangerous burn. My discovery of the text messages was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of a war. And in this war, my greatest weapon would not be aggression, but patience. I did not confront Sarah. To do so would have been to show my hand, to give her and Grayson the opportunity to retreat, to regroup, to construct a more sophisticated web of lies. No, I would let them believe they were safe in their secret world. I would become a ghost in my own home, a silent, watchful presence, and I would let them lead me to the truth. I would set a trap, and I would bait it with the one thing Grayson seemed to crave her more than anything, the illusion of an unguarded territory. The plan was simple, its execution a masterclass in domestic espionage. Grayson's pattern was predictable. He was a creature of opportunity, his unannounced visits almost always coinciding with my known absences. He was monitoring my life, my routines, with a predator's diligence. So, I would give him the opportunity he was waiting for, on a silver platter. That Friday, I staged my departure. I made a show of packing an overnight bag, of kissing Sarah and the kids goodbye, of complaining about a last-minute, mandatory work trip. I drove away, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, and I parked my car several blocks away, in a spot where it would not be seen. Then, I doubled back on foot, a commando infiltrating my own suburban territory. The hidden cameras had been my secret project for the past week. They were small, sophisticated, and easily concealed. Grayson himself had provided the perfect cover story, with his constant, unsolicited complaints about the house's outdated wiring. I had told Sarah I would handle the upgrades myself, and she, distracted and increasingly distant, had not questioned it. A camera in the living room, disguised as a smoke detector. One in the kitchen, tucked into a decorative plant. And the last one, the one that made me feel the most like a voyeur in my own tragedy, in our bedroom, hidden inside an old and used alarm clock. I took up my position in my neighbor's yard, concealed behind a thicket of overgrown bushes that offered a clear, unobstructed view of my front door. The wait was an exercise in excruciating, slow-motion torture. The minutes stretched into hours. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. I began to doubt myself. Maybe I had been wrong. Maybe I was the paranoid, jealous husband, constructing a grand conspiracy out of a few ambiguous text messages. And then, his car appeared. A sleek, black, predatory machine, gliding to a stop at my curb. My blood, which had been running cold, began to boil. Grayson emerged, his movements casual, confident, the walk of a man who believes he owns the world. He strolled up our driveway, as if he were returning to his own home. He knocked. I watched as Sarah opened the door. From my vantage point, I could not hear their words, but I could see the choreography. His easy, familiar smile. Her hesitant, uncomfortable posture. Michael's out of town, isn't he? I could almost hear his smooth, oily voice. I saw her hesitate, then nod. He said something else, and then he stepped inside. She did not stop him. She did not protest. She simply stepped back and allowed the wolf to enter her home. My fists clenched, my nails digging into my palms. I pulled out my phone, my hands shaking, and opened the app that connected to the cameras. The live feed flickered to life. There they were, in my living room. He was on the couch, lounging, his posture an assertion of ownership. She was standing a few feet away, her arms crossed, a shield against his presence. But she was there. She had not told him to leave. I watched, my breath held tight in my chest, as he began to close the distance between them. I saw him move closer, his hand coming to rest on the back of the sofa, inches from her shoulder. I heard his voice, a low, seductive murmur through the camera's microphone. "Relax, Sarah. You look so tense. You deserve a break." I wanted to scream. I wanted to smash the phone against the ground. I wanted to storm across the street and tear him apart with my bare hands. But I held back. I needed more. I needed him to cross the final, irrevocable line. And then he did. He leaned in, his hand reaching for her face. "You're too beautiful to be so stressed," he murmured. Sarah flinched, pulling away. "I think you should go," she said, her voice a thin, shaky thread. But he did not move. He stood, towering over her. "Come on, Sarah," he said, his voice turning darker, more insistent. "Don't pretend you haven't felt this. Your husband doesn't have to know." That was it. The line had not just been crossed, it had been obliterated. I bolted from my hiding place, a wave of pure, primal rage washing over me, erasing all thought, all strategy, all reason. He had made his move, and now it was my turn. The act of bursting through my own front door was a detonation. The quiet, tense domestic scene in my living room was shattered by my sudden, violent appearance. Grayson froze, his hand still hovering in the space where Sarah's cheek had been, his smug, predatory expression instantly replaced by one of pure, slack-jawed shock. He was a predator caught in the headlights, his carefully constructed world of manipulation and deceit incinerated in the harsh, unforgiving glare of my presence. I said nothing. I didn't need to. The rage radiating from me was a physical force, a palpable entity in the room. I stood in the doorway, my chest heaving, my gaze a weapon, and I simply stared at him. "Michael," Sarah gasped, her own face a canvas of conflicting emotions, relief, terror, and a profound, dawning shame. She scrambled back, putting a crucial few feet of distance between herself and the man who had been attempting to seduce her in her own home. Grayson, to his credit, or perhaps, to his profound, pathological arrogance, was the first to recover. He was a performer, and even in the face of this catastrophic plot twist, his instincts were to try and control the scene. He smoothed the front of his expensive shirt, a gesture of absurd, misplaced composure, and forced a grin that was a grotesque parody of his usual charm. "Michael, back so soon," he boomed, his voice a little too loud, a little too hearty. "I was just, checking in with Sarah. About a leaky faucet." "A leaky faucet," I repeated, my voice a low, dangerous rumble that seemed to come from a place deep within my chest. I took a slow, deliberate step into the room. "Funny, because from where I was standing, it looked like you were checking in on something else entirely." His grin wavered. He threw a panicked glance at Sarah, as if hoping she would corroborate his pathetic, transparent lie. She, however, was staring at me, her eyes wide with a new, dawning understanding. She was realizing I hadn't just come home early. I had been watching. "Now, let's not jump to conclusions," Grayson stammered, raising his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. You were just what, Grayson?" I cut him off, taking another step, closing the distance between us. "Because I saw everything. I heard everything. I saw you put your hands on my wife. I heard you try to convince her to cheat on me. In my house, while my children are upstairs. I let the weight of that last part hang in the air, a thick, suffocating blanket." His smirk, that infuriating, self-satisfied smirk, began to return, this time laced with a defiant arrogance. "Listen, Michael, you're overreacting. It was just a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" I laughed, a harsh, ugly, humorless sound. "You think I misunderstood the months of your creepy, unsolicited visits? The way you've been sniffing around my wife like a dog in heat? Or maybe I misunderstood the secret text messages on her phone. Which misunderstanding are we talking about, Grayson?" Please, clarify. The mention of the text messages was a direct hit. His smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of genuine panic. He looked at Sarah, whose own face had turned a sickly shade of pale. You went through my phone? She whispered, her voice barely audible. I had to, Sarah, I said, my gaze never leaving Grayson's face. Because you wouldn't tell me the truth. You let this snake, slither into our home, and you said nothing. Grayson, seeing the narrative slipping from his control, decided to double down on his bravado. He shrugged, a gesture of dismissive contempt. Look, maybe I got a little friendly. A beautiful woman like your wife, a man's going to appreciate her. Appreciate her? I repeated, my voice rising, the last of my control beginning to fray. You call this appreciation? Invading her privacy? Disrespecting her marriage? Making her a prisoner in her own home? The sound of small footsteps on the stairs made us all freeze. Emma and Liam stood at the top of the landing, their small faces pale, their eyes wide with a fear and confusion that was a fresh, sharp stab to my heart. Sarah saw them too. Michael, she pleaded, her voice a ragged whisper. Not in front of the kids. But it was too late. Grayson had brought this war to my home, to my family, and I would be damned if I let him walk away unscathed. You want to play the alpha, Grayson? I said, my voice now a low, menacing hiss. You want to come into my territory and mark it as your own? Let's see how you handle a real fight. I took a final step forward, until we were inches apart. For the first time, I saw it in his eyes. Not arrogance, not confidence, but a flicker of genuine, primal fear. He tried to backpedal, to de-escalate. Hey, let's just talk this out, man. But the time for talking was over. The time for patience, for strategy, for quiet observation, was over. He had underestimated me. He had mistaken my quiet nature for weakness. And he was about to learn a very painful, very permanent lesson. Get out of my house, I said, my voice a deadly, quiet command. And if you ever come near my family again, I will not be this polite. He hesitated, a fatal miscalculation. He tried to summon one last, parting shot of his trademark smirk. You're not as tough as you think you are, Michael. That was the moment the dam broke. A wave of pure, adrenalized rage washed over me. Before I was even consciously aware of my own actions, my fist connected with his jaw. The sound was a sickening, wet crack, a sound that seemed to echo in the sudden, terrible silence of the room. He stumbled back, a look of pure, unadulterated shock on his face, a thin trickle of blood appearing at the corner of his mouth. I stood over him, my chest heaving, my hand throbbing. Leave, I growled. Now. He scrambled to his feet, muttering a string of curses, and stumbled out the door, a defeated, bleeding animal. I stood there for a long moment, the adrenaline slowly beginning to recede, leaving behind a cold, shaking dread. Sarah and the children were staring at me, their faces a mixture of shock, fear, and something else I couldn't quite decipher. Grayson was gone, but I knew, with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the floor beneath my feet, that this was not over. Not by a long shot. The silence that descended upon the house after Grayson's ignominious exit was not a peaceful one. It was the heavy, ringing silence of a battlefield after a bomb has detonated, thick with the acrid smoke of rage and the shrapnel of broken trust. My knuckles ached, a dull, throbbing counterpoint to the frantic, hammering rhythm of my heart. I looked at the small, dark smear of blood on the hardwood floor, a stark, physical testament to the line that had been crossed. Upstairs, the children's muffled sobs were a heartbreaking soundtrack to the wreckage. Sarah stood frozen by the door, her hands pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror that was directed not at the departed Grayson, but at me. Michael, she whispered, her voice a thin, reedy thing. What are we going to do? It was a question I did not have an answer to. My actions had been primal, instinctual, a necessary and satisfying act of territorial defense. But the rational part of my brain, the part that had been temporarily short-circuited by a surge of adrenaline, was beginning to come back online, and it was screaming at me about consequences. Grayson was not a man who would accept defeat gracefully. He was a man who would seek retribution. We handle it, I said, my voice more confident than I felt. He won't be back. Sarah shook her head, tears finally beginning to spill down her cheeks. You don't know him, Michael. He's dangerous. He's vindictive. And you just gave him a reason to come after us. She was right. I had not just wounded his jaw. I had wounded his ego, a far more fragile and precious part of his anatomy. He would not let that stand. The first order of business was the children. I went upstairs to find Emma and Liam huddled together on Emma's bed, a small, trembling island in a sea of fear. "Is the bad man gone?" Liam asked, his voice a small, hiccuping whisper. I knelt beside the bed, my heart aching with a guilt so profound it was almost a physical pain. "Yes, buddy," I said, my voice gentle. "He's gone. And he is never, ever coming back. You're safe. I promise." It took a long time to calm them, to soothe their fears with a series of promises I wasn't entirely sure I could keep. When I returned downstairs, Sarah had cleaned the blood from the floor, but the ghost of it remained. She was sitting at the kitchen table, her head in her hands. "What if he goes to the police?" she asked, her voice muffled. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "He might. But we have the recordings. We have the proof of what he was doing, what he was saying. It's his word against a video camera. He'd be incriminating himself. And if he doesn't?" she asked, looking up, her eyes red-rimmed and fearful. "What if he does what he's always done? What if he uses his power, his connections, to make our lives a living hell?" That was the question that truly terrified me. Grayson's power was not in his physical presence, but in his influence. He was our landlord. He held the key to our home, our security. I spent the rest of that night in a state of hypervigilant paranoia, watching the camera feeds, replaying the confrontation, cataloging every threat, every nuance, every potential avenue of attack he might take. I was no longer just a husband and a father. I was a strategist, a soldier preparing for a long and brutal siege. He had underestimated me. He had mistaken my quiet, peaceable nature for weakness. He was about to learn that a man fighting for his family is the most dangerous animal of all. The storm was not over. It was just beginning, and I would be ready. The quiet that followed the confrontation was a deceptive, fragile thing. For a few days, the house felt like a sanctuary again, a fortress that had successfully repelled an invasion. The children's fear began to subside, replaced by the resilient, forward-looking optimism of the young. Sarah and I, united by a shared enemy, found a new, tentative rhythm, a partnership forged in crisis. But I knew it was the calm before the storm. Men like Grayson do not simply disappear. They retreat, they regroup, and they retaliate. The first shot in his war of attrition was not a cannon blast, but a quiet, insidious act of bureaucratic warfare. It arrived in the form of a letter, slipped under our door, the stationery thick and expensive, the words typed in a cold, impersonal font. "Michael, asterisk," it began, without salutation. "Asterisk, you have made a grave mistake. I am giving you one chance to rectify it. A public apology and a retraction of your baseless accusations. If you refuse, I will be forced to ensure you lose everything you hold dear. Sincerely, your alpha landlord, asterisk." The sheer, unmitigated arrogance of it was breathtaking. He was not just threatening me. He was still playing the part, still trying to assert his dominance from a distance. "What does he mean, lose everything?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling as she read the letter over my shoulder. I didn't know, not specifically, but I knew it was not an empty threat. Grayson had spent his life cultivating power, and he was not afraid to wield it. The answer came a few days later, in the form of a uniformed county housing inspector. He stood on our porch, a clipboard in his hand, his expression one of bored indifference. "Received a complaint," he said, his voice a monotone. "Unsafe living conditions. I need to conduct a full inspection." "Unsafe?" Sarah echoed, her voice incredulous. "That's absurd. This house is perfectly safe." The inspector simply shrugged. "Just doing my job, ma'am." For the next 2 hours, he moved through our home like a vulture, meticulously documenting every minor, insignificant flaw. A loose floorboard, a cracked tile in the bathroom, a faint water stain on the ceiling from a long-repaired leak. It was a transparently malicious campaign of nitpicking, and by the time he left, he had a list of violations that could, he informed us, result in our eviction if not rectified immediately. The next blow was more personal. It was aimed at my livelihood. My boss called me into his office, his face a mask of grave concern. He slid a folder across his desk. Inside were grainy, out-of-context photographs of me from the night of the confrontation, my face contorted in rage, my fist raised. These were sent to HR, anonymously, my boss said, his voice heavy with disappointment. Michael, I don't know what's going on in your personal life, but we cannot have this kind of thing associated with our firm. You're on probation, effective immediately. I sat there, my fists clenched under the desk, a feeling of helpless fury washing over me. Grayson was not just attacking my home. He was attacking my ability to provide for my family. He was systematically dismantling my life, piece by piece, from the outside in. That night, the fragile peace in our house shattered. He's trying to ruin us, I said to Sarah, the weight of it all crushing down on me. The housing board, my job, he's pulling every string he has. What are we going to do? She asked, her voice a whisper of despair. For the first time since this nightmare began, I had no answer. I felt cornered, outmaneuvered, a pawn in a game where he held all the power. And then, Sarah, my quiet, resilient Sarah, said the words that would change everything. What if we fight back? She said, her voice quiet but filled with a new, steely resolve. Not on his terms. On ours. What if we go public? Public? I asked, the idea seeming both terrifying and insane. Yes, she said, her eyes meeting mine, a fire in their depths I had not seen in years. He thrives in the shadows. He uses his power to intimidate people into silence. What if we refuse to be silent? You have the recordings, Michael. You have the proof of what he is. What if we show the world the real Grayson? It was a radical, high-stakes gamble. But as I looked at my wife, at the strength and courage in her face, I knew she was right. We had been playing defense, reacting to his attacks. It was time to go on the offensive. Grayson had built his kingdom on a foundation of fear and intimidation. It was time to burn that kingdom to the ground. The decision to go public was a declaration of war. It was a terrifying, exhilarating leap into the unknown, a final, desperate gambit against a man who had left us with no other choice. Grayson had built his power in the shadows, in the quiet, unlit corners of other people's fear. We were about to flood those corners with the harsh, unforgiving light of public scrutiny. Our first step was to organize our arsenal. I spent a long, sleepless night editing the camera footage, compiling every leering glance, every suggestive comment, every menacing threat from Grayson into a single, damning narrative. The video was a chilling portrait of a predator in his natural habitat, his arrogance and his entitlement on full display. But the footage was only one piece of the puzzle. I knew that to truly dismantle a man like Grayson, we needed more than just our own story. We needed a chorus of voices. I enlisted the help of a friend, an investigative journalist named David, who had a talent for unearthing the stories people tried to bury. David's investigation was a deep dive into the murky depths of Grayson's past. What he found was a pattern, a meticulously documented history of abuse and exploitation. He found former tenants, mostly single women and vulnerable families, who had been subjected to the same campaign of harassment and intimidation. He found whispers of blackmail, of financial impropriety, of lawsuits that had been mysteriously and quietly settled. Grayson was not just a bad landlord. He was a serial predator who had been operating with impunity for years. With this mountain of evidence, we approached a local news station known for its aggressive, in-depth investigative reporting. They were horrified by what we showed them. Within days, our story was the lead segment on the evening news. The headline was explosive, *Alpha Landlord or Serial Predator. Local families' hidden camera footage exposes a pattern of harassment, *. The broadcast was a firestorm. The footage of Grayson, arrogant and menacing in my own living room, was played on a loop. My own face, contorted in a rage I barely recognized, was there too. But in the context of the full story, it was not the face of an aggressor, but of a defender. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Social media erupted. Our story went viral. Grayson's carefully curated image as a powerful, successful businessman was incinerated in the court of public opinion. And then, something remarkable happened. The other victims, the ones who had been silenced by fear and NDAs, began to come forward. A woman called the news station, her voice trembling, to tell the story of how Grayson had threatened her with eviction unless she agreed to his advances. Another family came forward with evidence of how he had illegally withheld their security deposit after they had complained about his behavior. The trickle of accusations became a flood. Grayson's world began to crumble. His business partners, the powerful friends he had boasted of, began to distance themselves, issuing public statements of condemnation. The housing board, under intense public pressure, launched a full-scale investigation into his properties. My own company, faced with the full, unvarnished truth, not only rescinded my probation, but issued a public apology and offered me their full legal support. He tried to fight back, of course. He filed a ludicrous defamation lawsuit against us, a desperate, flailing attempt to regain control of the narrative. But it was too late. The evidence was too overwhelming, the chorus of voices too loud. His lawsuit was laughed out of court. The final, definitive blow came when the district attorney's office, armed with the testimony of a dozen different victims, filed a slate of criminal charges against him. Harassment, blackmail, extortion, attempted assault. The king was dethroned. I was in the courtroom with Sarah when he was arrested. He looked smaller, diminished, his trademark arrogance replaced by a pale, panicked fear. As they led him away in handcuffs, a profound, cleansing sense of relief washed over me. It was over. In the weeks that followed, a new, fragile peace settled over our lives. The house, once a battleground, was a home again. The children's laughter was a little louder, a little freer. Sarah and I, our bond forged in the crucible of this shared crisis, were closer than we had been in years. One afternoon, as I was in the backyard, finally building the swing set I had promised the kids, Sarah came out, a small, triumphant smile on her face. "The news station just called," she said. "They want to do a follow-up. About resilience. About fighting back." I laughed, shaking my head. "I think we've had enough of the spotlight to last a lifetime." "Maybe," she said, her eyes meeting mine. "But our story isn't just about us anymore, is it? It's about them. All the other families. It's about showing people that you don't have to be a victim." She was right. Grayson had tried to make us his victims, to break us, to silence us. But in doing so, he had unwittingly given us a voice. He had made us fighters. He had thought he was the alpha, the dominant force in our lives. But he had forgotten the most fundamental truth of the natural world. There is no force more powerful, more ferocious, more utterly unbreakable than a family united. I knew, even then, that the story was not entirely over. A man like Grayson, even from behind bars, could still cast a long shadow. But for now, we were safe. We were whole. And whatever came next, we would face it together. Because that, I had learned, is what it truly means to be an alpha.